I'm Sophia, and welcome to What We Need to Know About Ukraine. Here, I learn about Ukrainian history, literature, and culture, and share my findings with you. Today's episode is about Nestor Makhno, a Ukrainian revolutionary leader and anarchist in the early 20th century. Makhno's character, life, and evolving views provide a fascinating study of the First World War and its aftermath in Ukraine, the Ukrainian War of Independence of 1917-1921, and the definition of anarchism, its implementation and relation to the concepts of nation, nationalism, and government. Nestor Makhno was born in 1888 in Любо, then a small town and now a city in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, Ukraine. In 1888, the land was controlled by the Russian Empire. His family, just a little over 2 decades before he was born, was freed from serfdom under the reform of 1861. However, even after serfdom was abolished on paper, it was still a really long process. All serfs automatically became, quote, peasants under temporary obligation, meaning that although they were no longer property of their landlords, they were not given land either. At least not right away. The house and a plot of land was supposed to be bought out. When buying out the land, the peasant paid 20% of the amount and the rest was paid for as a loan by the state. The peasant undertook to pay the debt for the loan for 49 years. Before the peasant fully bought out the land, which would amount to the time to earn 20% of its price and 49 additional years, the landlord retained ownership of all the lands belonging to him, and the peasant was obliged to pay rent to the landlord with money and/or physical labor. In short, there was barely any difference in the way of life of the peasants for another 2 decades. Nestor's father died when Nestor was less than a year old, and his mother was left with little money to care for her 5 children. So when he grew a little older, he would herd the sheep and cattle of rich farmers in the summer and go to school in the winter. Nestor Makhno began to be active politically at the age of 17. In 1905 and 1906, Nestor supported the Ukrainian Social Democrats and even distributed their leaflets. In 1906, he became a member of the anarchist organization, the Union of Poor Peasants, which was operating in his town. The group advocated the creation of a stateless society based on free association to be achieved through social revolution. They considered expropriation and terrorism to be justified tactics to be used to try and achieve their goal, and therefore they conducted a series of robberies and even murders. The group believed that the money seized was needed for the revolution, and that they were attacking private capital in order to teach workers and peasants not to respect private property. The anarchists, which they were anarchists, used the seized money to purchase weapons, create new groups, as well as for propaganda and personal needs. Nestor Makhno took part in this as well. At the end of 1906, Nestor was first arrested on charges of terrorism. He was placed under police surveillance, but was soon released due to lack of evidence. This was followed by an incident that could be considered quite mundane for the time period. Makhno decided to help his friend get rid of his rival by opening fire on the street, but missed. In August 1908, Makhno was arrested again. He was charged with a murder, although he was not involved in it. Nestor Makhno's information was taken by the police and has been preserved. It states his name, height, hair and eye color, a scar on his left cheek, and that he spoke Ukrainian and Russian, was Christian Orthodox, and had no money or valuables at the time of his arrest. Makhno's ability to speak both Ukrainian and Russian should be noted here. Makhno and his friends were in prison for a year and a half. In March 1910, the temporary Odessa District Military Court took up the case of the 13 Gulyaipole anarchists, among whom was Nestor Makhno. During the investigation, Nestor said that he did not belong to any gang, but was a member of a political revolutionary organization that fought for freedom for the people, and that the money, after the expropriations, went exclusively to the revolution. The court sentenced 5 people from the group of anarchists, including Makhno, to be hanged. But Nestor's mother saved his life. Makhno was to be executed that same year, but his mother claimed that her son was only 19 years old at the time of his arrest, which was not the case, and the death penalty in the Russian Empire was applied from the age of 21. Because of this, Makhno's hanging was replaced by life imprisonment, and he was taken to Moscow, to Butyrska prison, to serve his sentence. And he was imprisoned there from 1911 to 1917. The Butyrska prison served as an important catalyst for Makhno's worldview. There he meets with other imprisoned anarchists, like Peter Arshynov, and learns and reads more about anarchist ideology. In 1917, Makhno was released since all political prisoners, of which he was considered one, were released. Why was that so? Well, 1917 was a tumultuous year. World War I was still ravaging the continent, and February Revolution was destroying the monarchy in the Russian Empire. The main reasons for the aggravation of the political situation in the Russian Empire were the empire's participation in the First World War, the mobilization of a significant number of peasants into the army, and as a result, a large number of human losses on the front. This led to the ruin and general impoverishment of much of the empire's population, deepened much of its socio-economic and political problems. From the beginning of 1917, dissatisfaction with the war and economic difficulties caused a mass strike movement, especially in large industrial centers. The revolution has not resulted in the immediate creation of the Soviet Union, which in itself was very similar to a colonial empire. Instead, there was a complex war, or even wars, with many belligerents and with varying interests. This was also the time that the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917-1921 started, also known as the Ukrainian War of Independence or the Ukrainian-Soviet War. Ukraine's political geography was quite complicated in 1917. The Central Rada of Ukraine, also known as the Central Council of Ukraine, was formed and declared Ukraine to be autonomous within the Russian Empire. The Ukrainian People's Republic also appears, formed by the governmental organ of the Central Rada, whom Makhno believes to be anti-revolutionaries, though they were also socialist. He was also against the, quote, Ukrainian state, or the, quote, Second Hetmanate, which was a state formed during the German occupation. In short, there were many participants and sides to the war, and Makhno's army was only one of them. To put it concisely, Nestor Makhno's revolutionary insurgent army of Ukraine waged an armed struggle against the Austro-Hungarian and German armies, the Ukrainian state, also known as the Second Hetmanate, the Directorate of the Ukrainian People's Republic, the Bolshevik Red Army, and the anti-Bolshevik White Army. Why oppose all of these groupings? Because they all sought centralized authority, which anarchists viewed as inherently oppressive. Of course, it is impossible to fight them all at once and survive. There were alliances which were made and broken throughout the war. During this period, anarchism in Ukraine was a counterweight to Ukrainian nationalism, Russian imperialism, and Bolshevism, and many other ideologies, all fighting for power. So what is anarchism? Anarchism is a political theory that advocates for the abolition of hierarchical government. Instead of a hierarchical government, anarchism is in favor of the organization of society on a voluntary, cooperative basis, without recourse to force or compulsion. There is therefore no political state, only free and voluntary association. Nestor Makhno was an anarchist. More specifically, he was an anarcho-communist, and did not believe in private property. Expropriation of the land of rich landowners, especially if they were not necessarily morally good people, was normal and just for the anarcho-communists. In a way, this is similar to Robin Hood, take from the rich and give to the poor. The lack of private property seems to tie together the anarcho-communists and the Bolshevik communists. However, there were key differences. In Bolshevik communism, property belonged to and was managed by, could be confiscated by, and was controlled by the state and the government. Meanwhile, in Makhnovshchina, also known as Free Territory, which was Makhno's anarchist state that he created, it was neither privately owned nor controlled by the state, as there was no state and no leader. In fact, it was intended to be collectively owned and managed by communities and workers themselves. Everything in the Free Territory was organized around principles of mutual aid and voluntary cooperation, instead of for-profit and state quotas. For this, trust and respect among individuals and communities were needed. But now let us return to Nestor Makhno in 1917. So, in 1917, he returns to his home where he starts his military and political career. He became one of the initiators of the founding of the Peasant Union, headed the local council of workers and peasant deputies, and the trade union of woodworkers and metalworkers. The local administration created by Makhno distributed the property of large landowners among the peasantry and forced local entrepreneurs to significantly raise workers' wages. In late 1917, early 1918, Makhno formed the Peasant Free Battalions, which began the fight against units from the southwestern and Romanian fronts, which were trying to break through the territory of Ukraine to the Don and join the White Army. He also created detachments which aimed at protecting the peasants' crops, grain, and food from being taken by the occupying Germans. Then he also created the Revolutionary Insurrectionary Army of Ukraine, which was one of the belligerents in the Ukrainian Revolution and was led by himself. The army had up to 120,000 people, 19% of which were Ukrainians, and the rest of various other nationalities. It took hold of lands in the southeast of Ukraine, in Zaporizhzhia, where Makhno was born, and the Zaporizhzhia Cossacks previously lived. The offensive of March 1918 of the German Austro-Hungarian troops forced Makhno to leave Ukraine. However, he returned home by train, disguised as a soldier. Several times the State Guard tried to catch him, but to no avail. And when Makhno did return to Ukraine in the summer of 1918, he organized a rebel detachment called the Black Guard and resumed his fight against the German Austro-Hungarian troops and the government of Hetman Skoropadsky. This was in part because of Makhno's personal dislike of Skoropadsky, the leader of the Ukrainian state, or the Second Hetmanate. Makhno's mother's house has been burnt down by the Hetmanate's people, and his older brother, an invalid who had fought in the First World War, had been shot because they believed he had taken part in the fight against the Germans and the regime of Pavlo Skoropadsky. Skoropadsky was also at the time associated by the peasants with taking food and taxes from his people for the German and Austro-Hungarian armies, though in reality this was not the case. Makhno, with no formal higher education, was from one of the lands that suffered most from this stealing of crops for the German army. In December of 1918, Makhno held talks with the leadership of the Ukrainian People's Republic Directory, but his attitude towards the Directory was negative as well. And from the beginning of 1918, Makhno began the struggle against the Whites, the Directory troops, and the Entente. Soon, however, the agreement with the Bolsheviks was signed, and the insurgent army formally became part of the Ukrainian Soviet Army. Why was an alliance formed with the Bolsheviks? Well, they were ideologically closer to anarchist communism, and an alliance was simply needed for the survival of Makhno's movement. However, the Bolsheviks were not a reliable ally, nor did they fully align with the ideology. The ideological justification of the Makhnovist movement in 1918-1920 was carried out by the Ukrainian anarchist educational organization Nabat, which was established in 1918, and which put forward the slogan of the Third Social Revolution. Makhno spoke out against any centralized power in favor of ensuring the life of working people on the basis of solidarity and self-government. And Makhno, in the face of two strong opponents in Ukraine, tried to become a third force alongside the Directory and the Bolsheviks. The Bolshevik authorities attempted to implement the policy of war communism, to carry out food distribution and to forcibly create the first collective farms and committees of the poor, and provoked resistance, of course, among the Ukrainian peasantry, which helped Makhno win favor. Nestor Makhno was very well liked by the peasants. His army was a peasant army, with no known trained military personnel involved, which makes his successes even more impressive. But it also showed that the peasants respected him. He was also called Batko Makhno, which translated from Ukrainian to Father Makhno. The use of father is an old Ukrainian way to respectfully address someone, widespread among the Cossacks and the steppe dwellers. The use of this address testified to the extraordinary respect for a person, almost equal to the respect of one's own father, defender, teacher, and savior. According to Viktor Bilash, the chief of staff of the Revolutionary Insurrectionary Army of Ukraine, who was witness to the event, the first time this address was used towards Nestor Makhno was when several units of Makhno's army, including himself, were surrounded by the Austrians in a forest. Quote, "There were 36 of us, being in the center of a forest. We did not know how to get out of the ring, encirclement, into the field. What to do? Stay here and hope for a breakthrough? We hesitated. Shchus, who was a supporter of dying in the forest, lost heart. His opposite was Makhno. He made a speech and called on everyone to try a breakthrough. The soldiers gave in to his influence and declared, "From now on, be our father and lead us wherever you go." And Makhno began to prepare a breakthrough. End of quote. The breakthrough was successful and the name stuck. Makhno did not approve of it at first, since it seemed to undermine the anarchistic equality he strove for, but eventually he accepted the title. Makhno was most active politically in the next few years until 1921. He fought against everyone, tried to create an anarchist society, and this anarchist society truly did exist as a state for at least 3 months on the territory of modern-day Ukraine, particularly where there once were the Zaporizhian Cossacks, and it is known as Vilna Territoria, or Free Territory in English. It was not really a state. It did not have a flag or an anthem, or designated government buildings, but was more of what Makhno really wanted as an anarchist. It was a union of communities. People would meet in any building or on the street and together come up with a consensus of how much food they need to grow and how will they trade with other communities. The main idea was for there to be no class inequality and for cities not to exploit the villages for resources. This is, of course, loosely based on the Zaporizhian Sich. The Ukrainian Cossacks, and in particular the Zaporizhian Sich Cossacks, were sort of proto-anarchists. The Sich, which was their state, was organized along democratic and egalitarian lines, with elected officials serving limited amount of time and subject to instant recall, while its land was distributed equally among citizens. It was this state that Makhnovщина, or Free Territory, was most closely resembling. In June 1919, Makhno's brigade, armed with Italian rifles and without ammunition, suffered a significant defeat during the White Army's offensive. The Soviet authorities accused Makhno's army of the collapse of the front and declared Makhno outlawed. While in the rear of the White Army, Makhno continued the fight, and in early September 1919 he completed the reorganization of his units, which at the time numbered around 80,000 fighters. That same month, Makhno concluded an agreement with the Ukrainian People's Republic. Yet at the time, he planned to kill Simon Petlura, who was its leader, in order to lead the Ukrainian People's Republic army himself. During September to October 1919, Makhno's troops fought against the White Army, destroying individual units and rare communications. At various times, they occupied Katerynoslav, which is modern-day Dnipro, Guляйполе, Oleksandrivsk, Mariupol, Nikopol, Melitopol, Berdyansk. Makhno was a very good military leader, even though he had no military training, and as I've mentioned before, his army was made up of volunteers that believed in Makhno's idea. Some sources also attribute to Makhno the invention of a tachanka, which is a horse-drawn, open wagon with a heavy machine gun mounted on the rear side. It is likely, however, that Makhno greatly improved it and became really skillful at using such weaponry effectively. And due to his effective military actions against the White troops in the Azov Sea, which significantly slowed down the advance of the White Army to Moscow, the Bolsheviks once again decided to offer Makhno a tactical alliance. But already at the end of 1919 and the beginning of 1920, large forces of Soviet troops were secretly mobilized against his army. Units of the Red Army not only fought against Makhno's detachments, but also carried out punitive operations against the local population, which sympathized with Makhno. In June 1920, an appeal of the Red Army to the peasants was published, with a call to help the Red Army eliminate the detachments of Makhno as the most dangerous enemy of Soviet power. Makhno responded by destroying individual Red Army units and liquidating local bodies of Bolshevik government. During the offensive of the White troops in September to October 1920, Makhno again began to approach the Bolsheviks, and on October 2nd, 1920 concluded a military-political agreement with the command of their southern front. However, immediately after the breakthrough to Crimea and the defeat of the White troops, the Soviet command, violating the signed agreement, began a sudden encirclement and total extermination of the Makhnovist units, which entered the territory of Crimea with them. During this, the most combat-ready part of the insurgent army was killed. Only a few hundred of them managed to break out of Crimea and report to the rest of the Makhnovists about the Bolsheviks' betrayal. Therefore, Makhno once again began to support the Ukrainian People's Republic detachments, concluded a truce with them and an agreement on a non-aggression and joint action against the Soviet government. Makhno had divided the remaining units into several independently operating formations, one of which was led by him into exhausting and fierce, almost daily fighting against the Bolshevik forces, carrying out a number of campaigns and raids along the Azov coast, on the Don and near the Volga. There was even a meeting of the Soviet Politburo, where it was recommended to draw attention to the need to urgently expel Makhno from Poltava region to one of the starving provinces, if it was impossible to eliminate him quickly. In August 1912, Makhno, having received a serious wound in the face, crossed the border with Romania with 77 fighters who survived in his combat unit. Makhno had to leave Ukraine, first to Romania, then Poland, and then France. There, he wrote his memoirs and kept in contact with anarchists until his death at the age of 45 from tuberculosis. Throughout his career and life as a whole, Makhno's views of anarchism did not change drastically. His primary motive for being an anarchist was to help the peasants, and he saw anarchism as the best way to do so by removing class differences and exploitation of the peasants. Keep in mind that serfdom was abolished not long before. This was the reason why, with time, Makhno became a Ukrainian anarchist. It may seem contradictory why an anarchist would agree to the idea of a nation. However, why did then Makhno himself call his army the Revolutionary Insurgent Army of Ukraine? Here we must note that he said of Ukraine, and that is probably because the people he cared so much about were Ukrainian, and actively so. For example, Makhno's wife, Galina Kuzmenko, was a school teacher of Ukrainian history, language, and literature, known for her activism and focus on the national aspect of Ukraine. She was one of the most important in the group of Ukrainian intellectuals who increased the amount of Ukrainian language materials in Makhno's movement. She used her influence over Makhno to try and Ukrainianize the cultural milieu of the Free Territory and the movement overall. So how did his view progress? Overall, the anarchistic stance towards peaceful life is that nothing should be enforced, including language. He said, quote, "The question of the language of instruction in schools should not be decided by our army, but only by the people themselves in the person of parents, teachers, and students. The order of Fee Mai Majewski, which banned the mother tongue in schools, is now cancelled as being forcibly imposed on our schools. In the interests of the spiritual development of the people, the language of school instruction should be the one to which the local population naturally inclines." End of quote. However, when the railway workers with whom Nestor Makhno met demanded that he speak to them in Ukrainian, he could not understand their request and got defensive. Quote, "I understood that this demand did not come from the Ukrainian working people. It was the demand of those fictitious Ukrainians who were born from under the rough boot of German Austro-Hungarian rule, and tried to force themselves to fit the fashionable tone. I was convinced that such Ukrainians needed only the Ukrainian language and not the full freedom of Ukraine and the working people who inhabited it. Despite the fact that they outwardly posed as friends of Ukraine's independence, internally, they, together with their hetman Skoropadsky, were clinging tenaciously to Wilhelm the German and Karl the Austro-Hungarian for their policy against the revolution. These, quote, Ukrainians, did not understand one simple truth, that the freedom and independence of Ukraine are compatible only with the freedom and independence of the working people who inhabit it, without whom Ukraine is nothing." End of quote. Here, Nestor seems accepting of the people's will to be Ukrainian, but not what comes with it. With time, however, Nestor seems to have understood that language, nation, and culture are important after all. After the last break with the Bolsheviks in the fall of 1920, Nestor Makhno was experiencing an acute ideological crisis. Historian Frank Sisson writes, quote, What is possible is that the virulence of his opposition to Ukrainian nationalism decreased in the face of what he saw as even greater enemies. Also, the triumphs of the Russian forces in Ukraine, Bolshevik or white, and the increasing self-identification of the masses as Ukrainian may have led him to think in Ukrainian terms. End of quote. The newspaper, Voice of the Makhnovist, in November 1920, has already started to change its rhetoric. It can be read. The Bolsheviks are guilty of preventing the working people from creating their own lives and calling on them to, quote, take power into their own hands, end quote. They are doubly guilty as strangers to the Ukrainian people, as people who came from Russia. In 1920 and later, the slogan, Independent Ukraine, began to be used more and more frequently alongside the former Makhnovist slogans, Free Councils. In the preface to his memoirs, Nestor Makhno wrote, quote, I can only regret one thing in publishing this essay. It is not published in Ukraine and not in the Ukrainian language. Culturally, the Ukrainian people are gradually moving towards the full definition of their own individual identity, and this is important. But the fact that I cannot publish my notes in the language of my people is not my fault, but the fault of the conditions in which I find myself. End of quote. Frank Sisson, in his work Nestor Makhno and the Ukrainian Revolution, summarized fairly well what drove Makhno to become, in his own mind, Ukrainian. Quote, the vehemence with which Makhno criticized his enemies for anti-Ukrainianism merely emphasizes the development of his own Ukrainian national consciousness. The direction of Makhno's thinking is in fact a testimony to the triumph of the Ukrainian national revival in the years after the revolution. For large segments of the Ukrainian population, the 1917 period and the revolt against the Hetman were crucial for the formation of a Ukrainian national consciousness. For Makhno, however, the crucial stage appears to have been the final imposition of the Soviet rule. All the evidence supports the assertion that Makhno and the Makhnovtsi carried on their struggle in an area where the Ukrainian issue was not of major importance. However, even in this area, the influence of the Ukrainian revival was felt. In order to communicate on a large scale with the Ukrainian peasantry, the Makhno movement required Ukrainian-speaking cultural workers. Above all, the presence of a nationally conscious Ukrainian, Makhno's wife, introduced a limited Ukrainianization. The emergence of a nationally conscious Ukrainian nation in the 1920s, which prompted the Communist Party to introduce Ukrainianization, was the final decisive influence on Makhno's thinking. While he never became a nationalist, he did to a degree become a Ukrainian anarchist. End of quote. In his memoirs, written in the last years of his life, Makhno displays a great deal of recognition for the Ukrainian nation, and even his own patriotism. He writes, quote, I began to lose my equanimity and almost cried for joy at the breadth of the development of the Ukrainian workers' and peasants' souls. Before me arose the peasants' will to freedom and independence, which only the width and depth of the Ukrainian soul could so quickly and strongly manifest itself. End of quote. Makhno's views on Ukraine, the Ukrainian nation, and the Ukrainian language changed over time, and changed for the better. He became Ukrainian. Makhno may not be a national hero. He may not have believed in political nations. However, he is a folk hero. A hero of the Ukrainian people in his striving to attain freedom for all.
Як батько заграє, ворог враз ридає, то є йти до кого молодому козаку. Червоні ліворуч, білі праворуч, а я піду до батька на гражданську війну. Любо, братці, любо, любо, братці, жить, нашим отаманом не приходиться тужить. І за балки лунко в береги вдарили одразу короткі батоги. Батько нахилився, коня у кар'єр, висікти сволоту цівку плечем впер. Першая куля порснула по мені, та й спасли ремені. А другая куля ранила коня, ще засвітла дня. Любо, братці, любо, братці, жить. З нашим отаманом не приходиться тужить. А третя куля цілила в мене, мого коня мене. Як терпець урвався, то не налякать, тільки дотягнуться, а на смерть начхать. Не сумуйте, батьку, нічого пенять. Ті, хто винуваті, вже навіки сплять. А що не владнали, та не домайстрували, буде того зілля нашим дітям дорубать. Любо, братці, любо, братці, жить. З нашим отаманом не приходиться тужить. Годі на сьогодні, браття, храбрувать. Коні потомились, хлопці хочуть спать. Нічого не шкода, ні врага і рода. Шкода тільки волі та й буланого коня. Любо, братці, любо, братці, жить. З нашим отаманом не приходиться тужить. Любо, братці, любо, братці, жить. З нашим отаманом не приходиться тужить.
Thank you so much for joining me today, and this was what we need to know about Ukraine this week.